It is lovely to be back here. The last time I was here, I was debating with David Alton about assisted dying, and Nigel Gilmore was a wonderful chair on that occasion. So it's fantastic to be back again. And I'm going to talk about the attempt to destroy the NHS. I have become radicalised over the last few years. I was a mild-mannered, well-behaved person, never got involved with marches. Unlike my wife, who recently was seen running through Boots shouting, "Pay your taxes," I've always been a well-behaved sort of individual. However, there comes a point at which you snap, and a few years ago, when the Health and Social Care Act was introduced, that's when you could have heard the snap throughout this kingdom. Now, I'm going to press the right side, I hope. Yes. Basically, the Health and Social Care Act, which I will talk about in a second, was passed in 2012. And I went to a BMA meeting 3 months later, having been pretty well disgusted by the failure of the BMA actually to oppose what is probably the greatest threat to the health of the people of this country, in a generation. And Jackie Davis and I, as a result of conversations with people at BMA, produced this book called NHS SOS. It's been succeeded by NHS for Sale, which came out a couple of months ago. And by the way, I'm not flogging the product to make a profit. All the proceeds go to something called Keep Our NHS Public. So there. I want to scroll back to the election of 2010, when you will remember there were an awful lot of promises, just as there are now. There was going to be no cutback in funding for the NHS, no hospital closures or indeed service closures, and no further reorganisations. Yippee. Well, what happened? No cutbacks in funding. You'll all be aware, of course, that there have been cutbacks in funding. The NHS expenditure very quickly dropped within a year of the election in 2010. And what's more, subsequently, growth in NHS expenditure fell far short of growth in the cost of medical care. So there's been about 1% increase in NHS expenditure in recent years, but of course the demand has gone up by 4%, and you don't have to be a genius to realise that's going to cause trouble. If we looked at what happened before the present administration, there was a very healthy growth in expenditure on the NHS. Between 2000 and 2009, growth in expenditure was about 5% or so. There was an initial fall and a further fall, and then it stabilised at about 1% increase. If you don't like numbers, that's what it's like in pictures. It's pretty obvious. You can see what's actually happened. So that's promise number one that was dishonoured. Promise number two would be no huts or hospital closures. Now, actually, I have no problem with rational reorganisation of services. I have shown form on this. I was responsible for a reorganisation of neurosciences in Greater Manchester, where we closed 2 neurosurgical centres, we closed 3 inpatient neurological facilities, and the whole thing was largely concentrated by coincidence on my own hospital, which was the Salford Royal Hospitals Trust. But it seemed like a good idea at the time, and the result is, I think, that neuroscience services in Greater Manchester have been improved. So I don't have a monosynaptic adverse response to closing services. But all of these closures that I won't go through have been driven by something other than patient need and rationalisation. There have been other cuts, and particularly the unkindest cut has been the cut in tariffs that foundation trusts and so on get for different services they provide. Let me give you an example of knee surgery. The tariff was $3,000 in 2009 and 10, and it's $1,500 in 2013 and 2014. And I don't think any of us will think that the price of things has fallen so dramatically in the interim. And trusts basically have lost out massively in terms of the reduction of tariffs. Most trusts, unsurprisingly, are in the red. You've just got to do the sums. And in fact, for the most recent figures we have, the total deficit of trusts is just under £500 million. So lots and lots of broken promises. But the most interesting and irritating and disastrous lie was the promise that there would be no more reorganisations. The Tories in the lead up to the 2010 election said no more top-down reorganisations of the NHS. There was an agreement in the coalition in May 2010 saying we will stop the top-down reorganisations of the NHS that have got in the way of patient care. Yippee! Just what the doctor ordered. My own experience of trying to practice medicine in an NHS that's been permanently reorganised is a bit like trying to write files while people are reformatting the disk. Within 6 weeks of that promise, David Nicholson, who was at that stage the much beloved chief executive of the NHS, was reporting that the reorganisation envisaged by the coalition was visible from outer space. And what it was, to be more precise, was effectively a Semtex suppository inserted between the cheeks of the rear end of the NHS. It was the Health and Social Care Act. We were told several things about the Health and Social Care Act, and I won't go through all the details. The white paper is very long and very boring, and the actual act is 346 pages long, which is 3 times the size of the act that enabled Anne Bevan to establish the NHS. But essentially, there were 4 myths related to the Health and Social Care Act, which I want to focus on. Firstly, it wasn't about privatisation, it was about something else. Secondly, and by the way, since the Act, privatisation has not been happening. Thirdly, by the way, even if it is happening, it's a jolly good thing. And finally, even if it is happening and it isn't a good thing, you can't stop it. And that's what I want to deal with. Because my story is not quite as glum as why we're all going to die soon. I think we can't do anything about the fact we are going to die, but I can tell you we can do something about the fact that the NHS is about to be torn apart if things happen on the 7th of May, which I personally dread. And I would emphasise I'm not a swivel-eyed Trotskyite. I'm actually slightly left of centre, and I want to confess publicly that I voted Lib Dem in 2010. So there's nothing wildly left-wing about me. Anyway, the Health and Social Care Act is not about privatisation, so we're told. What was in the white paper that justified the Health and Social Care Act? First of all, the NHS was a big problem. It was virtually a basket case, according to Andrew Lansley, of whom more presently. Secondly, it was about putting patients and GPs at the centre of the NHS. No decision about me without me was the mantra in relation to patients, and GPs were to have the budget to decide how the money should be spent on which patients. And both those things, of course, seemed excellent. And finally, it was about reducing bureaucracy. Well, first of all, was the NHS a basket case in 2010? Well, in 2011, and again in 2014, a New York think tank called the Commonwealth Fund compared healthcare systems in a variety of developed countries. And the 2014 report was based on data just before the Health and Social Care Act started its dirty work. And they compared healthcare in 11 industrialised countries. Here they are: Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, UK and USA. What did they find? They found that the NHS was top for quality of care, access, safety, value of money, and by the way, overall. It was Victor Ludorum in terms of the study. The one that got the wooden spoon, of course, was the United States, which was bottom on all of those criteria. But of course, the Health and Social Care Act was all about moving us statesward. The NHS expenditure, they pointed out, per head was $3,500. US expenditure per head, with much worse outcomes, was $8,500. So the basket case argument didn't stand up. What about putting patients at the centre of the NHS? In reality, there has been total disenfranchisement of patients. There's something called Health Watch, which is designed to be toothless. And in fact, we in Stockport have formed a group called Stockport NHS Watch, chaired by my wife, trying to find out what's going on. And I can tell you there are some real terriers in our group, and we cannot find out what is going on, what decisions are being made, and why they're being made. And so you can see, when it comes to putting patients at the centre of the NHS, when it comes to being accountable to citizens, that is totally untrue. It's the actual reverse of truth. What about putting GPs at the centre of budgetary and commissioning decisions? In reality, GPs, apart from some who've seen great personal advantages, of which I'll say a bit in a second, have been largely excluded. Just to give you an example of the new democracy in the health service, a couple of months ago you may have heard of something called Manchester devolution. They've downloaded £6 billion, so we're told, of health and social care funding to Manchester. Suddenly it's been freed from the apron strings of Westminster, so we're told. Actually, nobody in Manchester knew anything about it, apart from a small group. The LMCs didn't know about it, the MPs didn't know about it, none of us mere citizens knew anything about it. And of course, when you see George Osborne shaking hands with the leader of the Labour Council, then already you know something very odd is going on. I have to tell you, it's probably just a publicity stunt, because the outline business case hasn't been sorted yet, never mind approved. But it was a chance for those two characters, who are infinitely ambitious, to get their photographs in the paper. But it gives you some indication of the total disenfranchisement of the population when it comes to healthcare. As for putting the budget in the hands of GPs, this is a study from Pulse, reported earlier this month. What GPs think about the NHS reforms? Well, a small number think they have become more involved in commission decisions. They're in red, but the vast number in blue think they have become less involved. Most GPs feel disenfranchised. They do not know what's going on or why it's happening. And increasingly, commissioning in healthcare will be decided. Now, you can't afford to go to this place. I can only show you a photograph of it, but I won't charge you. This is the Virgin Islands. This is where most of the companies who are scooping up the big contracts actually are domiciled. And these are the characters who are increasingly entering what are called the commissioning support units, and they will decide what actually is commissioned, why, where and when. And if you think this is scare tactics, in February, Capita, otherwise known as Crapita in private eye, have just got a deal for £5 billion to support commissioning. Where do you think they're going to put the commissioning? I'll leave the question hanging in the air. What about the claim that it was about reducing bureaucracy? Well, in 2010 there were 160 bodies managing and regulating the NHS. In 2014 there are 443 bodies managing and regulating the NHS. I rest my case. What about the cost of bureaucracy? The NHS market has taken administrative costs from 6% of the English NHS, which it was before the internal market, to about 15%, which is where it is now, and it is rising very steeply. And this translates into £5 to £10 billion per annum to run this competitive market. So just for the sake of having competition, we are pouring billions and billions and billions of pounds down the lavatory. What about the Health and Social Care Act itself? Andrew Lansley's swivel-eyed lunatic idea. The visible costs are probably between £2 and £3.5 billion. Would have been lovely if that had been spent on patients, wouldn't it? The invisible costs are the endless quantities of clinical and managerial time, and also virtually 2 years of total paralysis in the run-up to the Health and Social Care Act. Cameron says it was his biggest mistake. Well, I have to tell you, the competition for that accolade is pretty fierce. But actually, he's being totally disingenuous when he said he had no idea what it was about. Of course he knew what it was about. The real reason for the Act was twofold. The first was opening up an accountability gap, distancing the executive from responsibility for the health service. The duty of the Secretary of State for Health is no longer to provide comprehensive health care, but only to promote it. And you know how Jeremy Hunt promotes it? Basically by endlessly jeering at doctors and people working in the health service. That's his view. And the duties of the Head Secretary of State for Health now could be summarised as follows. Centralising credit for any success, peripherising blame for disaster, and finger-wagging those idle clinicians, those GPs who don't refer people soon enough for testing for cancer, or those clinicians who are coasting, to use his phrase. So that was the first reason. But the other really big reason was to fulfil a long-held dream of the Tory party, which is to privatise the health service once for all. Now, I'm not talking about the use of the private sector as an episodic supplement, with which I have no problem at all. Of course, it's perfectly fine, to pick up the private sector and say we want to do this and then to put it down. What is much more worrying is when the private sector becomes systemic, structural and ultimately dominant, and then you can pick up the NHS and put it down. And I'll give you some examples of that. Who was supporting this privatisation? Well, there were certain ideologues, of which some presently. When it came to getting this very difficult act through the Parliament, the voting in support of the act was extremely important. 90 MPs and 142 peers who had private sector interests who actually voted the act through the different stages through the Parliament. Right-wing think tanks, Reform, who were often invited to talk on the Today programme, who actually turn out to be extremely right-wing individuals, totally opposed to a publicly funded public service, were great cheerleaders for the Health and Social Care Act. And also a minority of GPs who you had never heard of before. The general GPs themselves had never heard of them, who suddenly appeared from nowhere, who were the voice of general practice, who sought personal advantage. Chief of the ideologues was this character, Geoffrey Howe. Back in 1982, he produced a paper for the Cabinet, supported by his leader, Margaret Thatcher, who dreamt of dismantling the welfare state. Accepting, of course, this will be the end of the NHS, but you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. The aim was to end the state provision of healthcare so that medical facilities would be privately owned and run, and those seeking healthcare would be required to pay for it. This was not published because it was seen as politically very dangerous. I actually see it as deeply immoral, but that's just a detail. However, his dream did not die. Andrew Lansley basically clearly felt very much the same, and in opposition, when he first became the Shadow Health Secretary of State for Health, said the first guiding principle of public service reform is to maximise completion. And by the way, how I hate that word reform. Reform means messing about, kicking around, getting in the way of, screwing up, and so on and so forth, but it's called reform. There have been some major players who've totally in favour of dismantling the health service as a national publicly provided health service. One of them is Oliver Letwin, who was one of the key architects of the coalition agreement in May 2010. He rubbed his hands, having written a book in 1988 talking about privatising the world, said the NHS will not exist within 5 years of a Conservative election victory. My God, they've made a bloody good try at it, but they haven't quite got there yet. One of the difficulties, of course, in a democracy is if the public fundamentally disagree with what you're trying to do. 84% of the public are opposed to the privatisation of the NHS. But of course, they also have votes as well, which is rather annoying. So you've got to hide what you're doing from the public gaze. GPs were overwhelmingly opposed to the Health and Social Care Act, although Andrew Lansley was telling them that they would be put into in a powerful position. And the colleges were opposed to Health and Social Care Act, although I have to say their divided voice was absolutely pathetic, almost as pathetic as the BMA. I'll draw a veil over all that because I could get very cross and lose it. But one of the worries is that we have a profoundly corrupt nation now. This is Cameron's Republic, this fruit. William of Orange, we had the Glorious Revolution, but we've moved for a different fruit now. Orange is not the only fruit, and we now have the banana. And unfortunately, we live in a banana republic, where the democratic process, where 84% of people are opposed to privatisation of the NHS, basically their views can be trampled on. All sorts of people who had a very important role in designing the Health and Social Care Act, in making sure that it got through the parliamentary process, and also its implementation, had very, very serious conflicts of interest. There was the interchangeability of poachers and gamekeepers. I've mentioned already parliamentarians who supported the bill, but ex-ministers rotated between the Department of Health and the private sector. Likewise, advisors. Think of our current Chief Executive of the NHS, Simon Stevens. For nearly a decade he worked for United Health. United Health, by the way, have been brought up before the federal government for fraud. But he was a major player in developing United Health, and in particular its foreign operations reaching into Europe. So there we have, at the very heart of the NHS, a man who has worked very closely with United Health. People were on both sides of the fence. We had advisors telling government what to do, who then morphed into lobbyists to say, please buy our products, government. Let me give you one particularly sickening example. The Health and Social Care Act had a very difficult passage through Parliament because one or two people actually had values. The most difficult battle was in the House of Lords. But this is the man who really was very, very important in getting the Act through the House of Lords. A former banker, Tory health spokesman, star performer, and somebody who people were incredibly impressed by. He's very polite and so on and so forth. I've described him as the KY jelly to ease the passage of Lansley's Semtex suppository. The bill, he said, does not do anything that may or could lead to the privatisation of the NHS. Clinicians will be free to commission services in the way they consider best. They will be under no legal obligation to create new markets. That's actually the opposite of what the bill says. However, speaking amongst his friends, he said there will be genuine opportunities for the private sector to take over large parts of the NHS, though the NHS will not give up their patients easily. In the coming months and years, the NHS is going to grow into a very different animal. The NHS reforms present huge opportunities to the private sector, etc., etc. One thing in the House of Lords, another thing talking to his friends. He reassured everyone that Section 75 of the Health and Social Care Act, see, not only have I become badly behaved, but I've become an anorak as a result of this act, all services must be put out to competitive tender. Section 165 said foundation trusts can earn up to nearly 50% of their income on private patients. And by the way, all hospitals are services to become foundation trusts. So, of course, it was about privatisation, not about all the things that Lansley claimed it was about. But then people said, well, you think it's about privatisation, but actually it hasn't worked out like that. Jeremy Hunt, privatisation isn't happening, he said. And by the way, the decision to privatise is being taken by GPs. It's a bit like Billy Bunter. You know, the cake wasn't stolen, and by the way, I didn't steal it. Privatisation is happening. Between 2012 and 2014, only one of those years was the Health and Social Care Act in action. The proportion of NHS out to private sector increased by 40%. Against a low baseline, admittedly. And I'm aware that Professor Brian Farragher's in the audience, so we have a statistician, I've got to be very careful, more or less. But a third of contracts have gone out to the private sector. But the important thing is the pace is quickening. If you push something down a slope, it starts off very slowly, and then it really picks up speed. In 2015, in the last 2 months, Capita, I've already mentioned, have received a contract of $5 billion for commissioning, and NHS commissioning. There's a consortium of private providers who have just scooped a contract of $700 million for elective surgery, and in East Staffs, just a couple of weeks ago, Virgin have managed to scoop £280 million to deliver on something called Improving Lives. And basically, these are the data. I won't bore you, I guess you get the general picture. What's happening in foundation trusts? What are they doing with this new freedom to increase their private income? Well, there's the graph. In the right, in the left, on red, it's under the previous administration, and you can see what's happened in the present administration. So the trend is clear-cut, and the pace is accelerating. Just to give you another example, in Staffs, 4 CCGs have united to put out a contract for $1.2 billion for end-of-life care and cancer care. No NHS bidders have been shortlisted. There's 5 bidders. At one stage, Lockheed was in the frame. Lockheed make Hellfire missiles, so you can see when it comes to end-of-life care, it could be quite economical. But you haven't heard the worst. Many of you may or may not have heard of TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. This is a deal that's been struck between the American federal government and the EU. And essentially it's got a very important clause in it called the Investment States Dispute Settlement. And what that clause says is that governments are no longer allowed to interfere with basically the practice of business. So if, for example, the government got in the way of a private sector bid for a part of the NHS, they could be sued. Let me give you a particularly egregious example of this, of a similar treaty as it operated in Australia. Philip Morris, Philip Morris decided they were very unhappy that the Australian government passed legislation to insist that cigarettes should be sold in plain packages, because they discovered what has always been denied, that it would actually reduce consumption of cigarettes. So the Australian government was getting in the way of their trade. They have sued the Australian government. And this is what will happen. We will lose all our democratic control over our public services if TTIP gets through. The Tories are totally relaxed about TTIP, and they have not made any commitment to blocking or to protect public services from TTIP. All the other parties, this is not a party political broadcast by the way, all the other parties, Green, Plaid Cymru, SNP, Labour, etc., are all opposed to TTIP, or at least will protect public services and TTIP. Some of you may say, well, yes, perhaps it is happening, but you know, it's a jolly good thing. What the NHS has always needed is a kick up the sacral zones, and this is what privatisation is doing. It's cheaper, it's more innovative, and by the way, it's better. Cheaper? Well, no, it isn't. If you do international comparisons, you will find basically that the most expensive services are those that have the maximum amount of privatisation. In the States, they spend 18% of their GDP on healthcare. It's only 8.8% in the UK. And of course, they have the worst results compared with of those 11 healthcare systems that I referred to. But here's a recent study just published by the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, so it must be true, a couple of weeks ago, comparing the performance of alternative providers for general practice with the traditional providers. So they looked at what Virgin Healthcare and Care UK and all the others who've taken over 347 general practices, 4% of practices, how they performed compared with the remainder. And basically, they have performed worse on 15 out of 17 indicators. And that, by the way, is a properly designed study, so adjustment was made for the characteristics of the population served. So much for the claim that basically privatisation will raise the game. And here's a quote from the paper: "The introduction of new alternative providers to deliver primary care services has not led to improvements in quality and may have resulted in worse care." And so on and so forth. It's worse than that. If you have privatisation, then actually all those things that make the health service work as one, work together well, are now blocked. The competition laws get in the way of buddying schemes, mergers, cooperative cancer care, reclaiming out-of-hours services, and cooperation between health and social care. And this is an example of the extent to which privatisation leads not to organisation, but to disorganisation. Of course, the endless process now of tendering, as opposed to rolling out contracts, is incredibly disruptive and time-consuming. It does lead to fragmentation of the service at a time when we need a service to work together not only across the medical disciplines, but of course between health and social care. Private sector, quite properly, will cherry-pick those things that will generate the best profit. If I was a shareholder in Virgin Care, I'd be extraordinarily cross if they started becoming altruistic and decided that they were going to support healthcare without making a profit. Competition is anti-cooperation. You don't want to let the people down the road know what you're up to. You certainly don't want to let them know how bad your service is if it is bad. Cooperation can become subject to legal action, and that can result, of course, in great problems. And also, if a foundation trust loses a great lump of its work to the private sector, then this can become very destabilising. And it's very expensive to mothball a foundation trust. We have cooperation for the benefit of patients replaced by competition for the benefit of shareholders, as Paul Hobley said. And I want to give you a particularly sickening example of this in Bournemouth and Poole. I've got the slides, so I'll tell you the story. About a year or so ago, Bournemouth and Poole Trusts decided they would work better if they became a single trust. They did the sums and they reckoned to save £14 million a year. What's more, there were going to be direct patient benefits. For example, they would be able to provide consultant cover in A&E 24/7, which is exactly what you would want. It was supported by the clinicians, it was supported by the managers, it was supported by the local politicians, it was supported by the people. About to go ahead when Spire down the road raised its finger and said, hang on a moment, this is a cartel, this is anti-competitive. They brought everything grinding to a halt and then started a legal case, which has cost Poole Hospital £6 million. What's more, all the benefits that were going to be gained have been stopped. And that's put the frighteners on clinical commissioning groups, because they now think we have a duty to public money and we mustn't break the law and end up with all sorts of lawsuits which will squander public money. So suddenly, endeavours, imaginative, innovative endeavours to cooperate across the board within the NHS have been brought to a halt. The process of tendering is incredibly expensive. In Cambridgeshire there was a massive tender for adult and older person services. The tendering process cost between £1 million and £10 million. Nobody knows how much it cost. But actually in the end it went to the NHS, that one, because basically of a huge hoo-ha. I'll talk about that in a second. What a waste of money. £10 million possibly. Never mind all the time of clinicians and managers who could have been getting on with thinking about Mrs. Smith's diabetes and Mr. Jones's stroke and so on. There are incredibly wasteful transaction costs. The NHS market, the internal market and the external market, is now estimated to cost between £5 and £10 billion a year. Actually, there's been an estimate from Charles West, who was a Lib Dem rebel, that it may be up to £30 billion a year. Worse than that, your money is diverted into the profits of healthcare, private healthcare companies. And worse still, those profits don't recycle in this country, they're diverted to tax havens. So there's no multiplier effect, as the Keynesians would say. So that's basically where the profits from privatisation of the NHS are going. There's also a lack of accountability. We have huge problems of accountability, of course, in the NHS, but commercial confidentiality trumps everything. No sharing of data, no obligation to publish results, and the private sector is protected from freedom of information requests. A recent study published by a think tank reports that the NHS is struggling to monitor the safety and efficacy of its services outsourced to the private sector. 16% of the contracts managed by a CCG are now private, and a survey carried out by the Centre for Health and Public Interest and published early this month found that 60% of CCGs didn't record inspections of private services or outsourced services, or they were unable to say how many they'd done. And 12% of these outsourced services had not had any site inspections at all. They were out of sight and out of mind. Every now and then, of course, it breaks out into the street. The example of Vanguard in Taunton, who are providing ophthalmology services, who had damaged a sufficient number of people's eyesight to actually be called to account and had to withdraw from the service or disservice they were providing. The private sector, of course, is brilliant at tendering. It's what they're doing all the time. Doctors and managers do it only as amateurs. And as Margaret Hodge, scourge of the Public Accounts Committee, said, that many of the private sector are better at tendering than delivering. Serco, she said, is good at getting contracts and hopefully at delivering services. Circle, as you may know, picked up Hitchingbrook Hospital, which is in financial trouble and appeared to have poor problems with its clinical services, and said we'll solve the financial problem and we'll make it a centre of excellence. Well, earlier this year, they basically just dumped Hitchingbrook Hospital. It wasn't making any money for them. They were very cross because there was increased patient demand because of winter pressures, and they got a most appalling CQC report. Thank you, Circle. Thank you very much indeed. But that doesn't stop them still circling around, and they are still circling. They're still picking up more contracts. You can't have a bad enough track record not to win a further contract in the NHS. Think G4S. They have minimal or no commitment to training, education or research. In that sense, they're parasitic. And of course, no commitment to the overall health of the nation. We're talking about the overall health, basically, of the balance sheet. And there's also something even more sinister, which is the undermining of the ethos of public service. Profit is the main motive. You need to shift product as much as possible. You need to exploit a patient's lack of knowledge. If there are 2 treatments for a particular condition, then if you're trying to maximize your profits, it's entirely appropriate. You'll recommend the treatment that produces the biggest profit margin. There are perverse incentives to increase costs. Do more and more investigations, because every investigation basically has a tariff associated with it. Most profoundly, and this is what worries me most of all, is the potential deprofessionalisation of healthcare workers. Suddenly the loyalty to your profession, to healthcare across the nation, to wanting to do good and do things, make the difference, becomes loyalty to your firm. So this is what really the Health and Social Care Act about. This is what putting clinicians in charge is all about. It means putting this character in charge. And by the way, his tentacles are reaching further and further and further. The amount of contracts that he now has in the health service exceeds £1 billion. And that's just a little hobby on the side. He's got lots of other things. Okay, so privatisation really is what the Health and Social Care Act is about. Privatisation is happening, and privatisation on a large scale is a disaster. But the genie is out of the bottle, we're always told. You know, the horse is bolted. You can't stop privatisation. Well, here's a couple of examples. Leadership from clinicians, leadership from the people. In Cambridge, there was this £800 million contract to run older people and adult services. It went ultimately to an NHS consortium after a huge, massive public outcry, with extraordinarily, for the first time, the media actually awake to what was going on. Some of you may have heard of the Nottingham dermatologists, we'll have to call them the Nottingham 5 in future. Basically, Circle decided it wanted to pick up. Circle of Hitchingbrook? Circle decided they wanted to run the dermatology services. 5 of the NHS dermatologists said, stuff this, and they actually left. The only dermatologist who remained was the professor of dermatology, who had to stay where he was, because basically his academic department was in the hospital in Nottingham. The other 5 went to Derby, where they are working for the NHS. They could do that because there are more dermatology posts than there are dermatologists at the moment. What about the politics? What about what's going to happen in a week's time? Well, the Tories, I have to tell you, are totally in favour of the Health and Social Care Act. Although they said it's a big mistake, there is absolutely no way they're going to reverse it. And they're no way going to shoot the goose that lays the golden eggs for their friends. And by the way, the intimate relationship between the Tory party, Tory donors, and people who benefit from the privatisation of the NHS is absolutely extraordinary. I won't take the details. But because this is not a party political broadcast, essentially there's a pile of parties who will basically are committed to repealing the key bits of the Health and Social Care Act. Not to another reorganisation, but to repealing Section 75, Section 165, to restoring the duty of the Secretary of State, etc. Labour Party, the Greens, SNP, and Plaid Cymru. UKIP is funny. If you want to find out UKIP's policy on the NHS, you have to check each day, because it changes. In fact, you ought to check twice a day, because it can change with dizzying speed. But none of us, I trust, in this room would want to vote UKIP anyway. Labour are repentant. Andy Burnham, who was the last Secretary of State for Health under Labour, is very committed to repealing the market, scrapping Section 75, making the NHS the preferred provider, ensuring the NHS is protected from TTIP, placing tougher controls on hospital earnings from private patients, and restoring the duty of the Secretary of State for Health. An even stronger sounds are coming from the smaller parties. I mentioned SNP, Plaid Cymru and Green. In fact, I feel disenfranchised the fact that I can't vote SNP. In the meantime, we can fight on the ground, although we in Stockport, Terry and I and all the gang, have found it a very difficult business. I think making life hell for the CCG by pressing for details of tendering processes, finding out the private health interests of CCG board members. In Stockport, 3 of the board members have close relationships with KGMP. KGMP? What's that got to do with health? I think you know now. And what did the winners offer that won them the bid? You know, what was it about? How will the delivery be monitored? What sanctions if they fail? How are the staff to be treated? One of the things that Circle did was basically to sack a lot of people when they took over Hitchingbrook Hospital, and then they discovered if you sack a lot of people, patient care deteriorates. What a surprise. How will the public know what's going on? And can't we wake up our media once and for all? Claire Garrado, who is one of the true fighters against the Health and Social Care Act, and one of the few leaders of colleges who showed any kind of courage. She said the new reforms remove the legal framework for a universal, publicly managed, publicly planned, democratically accountable health service. And that's what's happened. It's been concealed, and it will take time, perhaps 5 or 10 years, for the full transformation to a destroyed health service to take place. But of course, as care gets worse, so the rhetoric will get better and the PR will be more skillful. My feeling is if the Health and Social Care Act isn't repealed and privatisation stopped, some of our fellow citizens may die, many more will suffer, and yet more of you, perhaps not us, but perhaps the general public, will face financial ruin trying to make up for the shortfall in healthcare. And I feel it basically trashes all I stood for in my 37 years as a physician. So, my message to you, ladies and gentlemen, is not as glum as we're all going to die soon. Things are bad, but actually, we shouldn't let them get away with it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ray. It was a very entertaining overview of our contemporary theme, what's going on at the moment. I'm sure you'd take some questions.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Particularly from people who disagree with me. Yeah.
You mentioned waking up the media, but most of the media are owned by press barons who are not on the left. How do you do that then?
I agree with you, but actually the problem is worse than that. Even the slightly left-wing media, like The Guardian and Independent, didn't really properly cover what was happening. I mean, when the bill passed in 2012, the strapline was, bill that gives budget to GPs passes. There was never any deep analysis of what was going on. So I think the situation, you're absolutely right. It's been estimated over 80% of the media is in the hands of the Barclay brothers or of the Murdochs. But actually, I just think our media are rather lazy. They rely on something called journalism, which is not journalism. It's basically recycling press releases. So we need to wake them up. How we do that, I'm not sure.
That was a fantastic forensic dissection of what we've all felt, but seldom had the numbers to put in front of others. Can I make 2 brief comments and questions? Comment in response to the last one. A sad fact about the LMI as a past president is that I know that this is an ageing society, so we're not up to date with what happens to the media. I think the way to approach the media is to place a lot of this material online in forms that people can and will watch it, to use organisations, activities like Twitter and other things, to outflank the fact that the Tory press barons run the media. The second comment would be that throughout your talk I was reminded of a statement from a comment about the last Labour government, that they were all right, but they believed that administration was weightless, that there is no consequence for change, and yet repeatedly, as is evident from what you've shown us there's huge consequences, fiscal and personal, from introducing changes that are ill thought out. And that's my question. I spent some time working in the Department of Health. I was struck by the charm and literacy of the arts graduates who ran the Department of Health. And what there are people who understand numbers, and yet the case you make is profoundly driven by numbers.
Yeah.
So philosophically, is this a criticism of our educational numeracy, that people cannot accept the numbers, the scientific basis, that irrespective of what your philosophy is, actually the NHS really is cheaper and isn't delivering bad care, despite what people tell you. So have we got a sort of functional numeracy?
God, I think it's such an interesting question. I mean, because obviously our political masters and our administrative masters are largely people who have come from humanities backgrounds. But I don't think innumeracy is the problem. I do think that when you're distant from the front line, everything seems very simple. I mean, I used to run incontinence clinics, and it was always difficult. It never got so. I gave up doing clinics, but I kept on giving my lectures, and the lectures got more and more fluent as the clinics were more receded into my past. And I feel it is a distance from the real mess of the real world that is the problem. And that's, in relation to that, it's the marginalisation of clinicians who are totally in tune with the real mess of the real world, with the clinic that's running behind, with a patient, who's got problems you didn't expect. We've been marginalised. I think we've got to fight our way back to the centre and saying we should be calling the shots. It's been dismissed by people like Julian Legrand as provider interest. But actually that's where we should really, and this is where I feel the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges has disappointed me, because if those 12 bodies in the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges got together and spoke with one voice, they would really, really be incredibly powerful. Trouble is, an awful lot of people have got something called gong fever, which I think is one of the most destructive elements, but that's a little... As for social media, I do Twitter, but I can't get anybody to follow me.
I was told that at the 20 teaching hospitals in the United Kingdom that they've got a combined debt of 2 billion. And all this remains hidden. There's a conspiracy of silence across all trusts regarding the debt. Because I think if people were aware of what debt actually exists in a health service, they'd understand it isn't being run very well. Do you think that's because of gong feed with executives, or because of the salaries they're allowed to pay themselves as part of being foundation trusts?
I think a bit on the column A and a bit on the column B, and also a bit on the column C, which is a sort of free-floating timidity and fear, which seems to me to be absolutely everywhere. The great thing about an old fart like me is that I have nothing to fear except death. And I can absolutely say what the hell I like, but it's amazing how so many people are terrified at speaking out. All the rhetoric about supporting whistleblowers is absolute nonsense. Whistleblowers, you've got to be bloody brave to be a whistleblower, or like me, on the breaker's yard, which is fine. So I think it's three reasons, I think. Also perhaps the fourth one, which is you're so busy dealing with the day-to-day that you're not able to abstract yourself and make a comment about the larger picture. It's very interesting the figure you give of 2 billion, because that is almost exactly the amount of money the NHS actually returned to the Treasury in the year 2012-2013. Because those foundation trusts that made a profit returned it to the Treasury. So we don't really have the kind of problem we said. Sorry, yes.
Back row there.
Not so much a question or an observation. Thank you, really. At the last election, I also voted Lib Dem, and my wife and daughter, who were card-carrying members of the Labour Party, didn't speak to me for weeks. She also has a degree in theology and really admires your thinking. And so, just to thank you that if Raymond Tallis could get it wrong, so it's okay for me too.
Well, yes, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, they just seemed a great promise. We should have gone Click Neg instead of Nick Clegg, basically. Yeah.
Julie.
I wonder how the people who know about health, doctors, nurses, midwives, how they can regain any power.
Yeah.
About just before Easter, there was a meeting here in supper afterwards, and I was one of the hangers-on at the end, surrounded by, it so happened, 6 consultants from Broad Green Heart and Chest Hospital. And I asked them, I said, I can't never understand how the consultants have lost so much power.
Yeah.
I don't know how it happened, but how can we get it back? What happened? And one of them said, Tony, if I raise a matter, say that we haven't got enough nurses, or there isn't enough theatre time, or that they've sacked so many of the ODAs that we can't recruit ODAs and there's no emergency cover. If I do that, they'll say, Doctor, I can replace you with somebody much cheaper.
Yeah.
And the other 5 all agreed.
Yeah.
I happen to know, well, she's my wife actually. She was sacked she's been 23 years a midwife. In appeal against dismissal, the president of Royal College of Obstetricians said she'd be delighted if my wife looked after her family. One of the professors of obstetrics wrote that she was an example of all that was good about the Women's Hospital, but that her appeal was dismissed.
It's interesting what's happened, isn't it, to...
Throughout that hospital,
yeah.
there is intimidation and fear. My question is, what can we do about it? Or what can they do about it? I can't do it.
I mean, I think several things happen. First of all, in the past, often the senior clinicians use their authority in an inappropriate way, often genuinely to serve their own interests, or to maintain an order of things that was to their benefit, or, was fitted with things that were convenient for them. I'm not talking about the majority, but there was a sufficient number. So there was genuinely a problem to be addressed about the misuse of the power of senior clinicians. I think there was, subsequent to that, and it's swung completely the other way now, but the other is we've been broken up into small atoms. There used to be a body. Now there are just bits and pieces around the place. Every single item that supports collegiality has gone. So we don't speak with a coherent voice, except through mediating through the colleges, which seem fairly distant and intermittent. And those colleges themselves, when you have 12 colleges, talk about divide and rule.
And
Thank you very much for that. I am going to challenge you.
Good.
Because I think you've got a big gap. I've seen your book. I haven't read my page, but I have looked through it and support much of your fears about what is going on. But there is a huge gap in what is not being reported here, which is the development of the young. The education that we provide through young doctors in healthcare in this country is never mentioned in any of this. As you briefly mentioned, it is not being provided by the private sector, but actually it rarely appeared in the health and social care bill. I think there was one little line about it, but it was hardly there at all. The people that are being totally disenfranchised are the people coming out of medical school, all of the young doctors who really are within, I would say, 10 years qualification, have no idea of what we're talking about old-fashioned healthcare. And they're not even being coached in the jobs they're in right now to develop collegiality. And it is appalling, and I'm afraid it is up to the people on the ground to actually re-engage with these people and make them realise that they and us are in the same boat, and that we should all be pulling together. And I've seen some awful things happening in education about young people almost being put against consultants there because they're on some program that is actually encouraging them to think that what we do as old grey hairs is actually really rather old-fashioned and something we shouldn't be doing. So I think there is a big gap in the monies or the effects that are being lost by the young not being included in your comments about the loss. You talk about loss of money, you talk about anxiety, the public sector. But actually, in 10 years' time, we may be horrified. There was a hospital in this city where a third of its foundation doctors at the moment are taking, after their foundation is going abroad. Two-thirds going abroad, 1/3 staying abroad. I've never heard so many go from one term probably most of them will come back. But nevertheless, 20 years ago, that would have been 1 or 2. 10 years ago, that might have been 5 or 6. But about a third of a lot of approximately 50 or 60 people is a lot of people. And it isn't there. So what are we going to do about that, sir?
Linda, I entirely agree with you. In fact, I covered a bit in Hippocratic Oaths a decade before. And it was very much an obsession, which is what is happening to depression. It seems to me this is a reflection of bigger trends. The replacement of a covenantal society by a narrowly contractual one. Suddenly people, medicine is a contract. You do so many hours, you get such a pay. As opposed to a covenant you have with your patients. Now I'm idealising, because, you know, we're not all saints. And that in turn is a reflection of the increasing dominance of neoliberal economic thinking that actually goes right through everything, whether it's the professions, whether it's provision of public service and so on. So I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that makes the problem a more difficult one, because if we haven't got the young doctors and younger clinicians more broadly on our side, then I think we really, really are stuffed. You know, who cannot remember what it was like and what...
Talk in economic terms about whether they're getting value for money, whether they come and work with you in a clinical situation. Actually, what education are you giving them? And actually, if they don't think you're giving it to them, they complain about it. The whistleblowing systems within the healthcare systems are creeping in and are following.
And that's more broadly true also in the education system more broadly. You know, I paid $9,000 a year for my tuition fees and I want value for money. And that includes getting a 2-1, which everybody has to get unless they've been robbed. And also, you know, you're not going to put up with one bad lecturer, even if that lecturer actually is quite a good lecturer, but rather eccentric. Yeah.
I think something you haven't mentioned is the organisations which are trying to do something about this sort of thing. And they do exist. Anybody can join them and support them, even if as an individual in your wherever you work it's more difficult. And I'm particularly talking about Doctors for the NHS, which was previously the NHS Consultants Association.
Yeah.
Please join. And by the way, I do follow you on Twitter.
I knew somebody did. But actually, just picking up on that, I think doctors of the NHS are fantastic. It was with the NHS Consultants Association that was seen to be rather narrowly hospital-based. And I've always thought it was a fantastic organisation with no resources, and it produces a very, very good journal, little magazine every 3 months. But I think it is great hope, doctors of the NHS, in parallel with Keep Our NHS Public, which has got...
That's where most of Doctors for the NHS money goes to, is supporting Keep Our NHS.
Exactly. And likewise... Yeah, and then there are some groups... One of the problems is other groups get deeply involved in more broader things, like trying to bring down Western capitalism, all that sort of stuff, which is, you know, too big a job for me. But I'm very glad you mentioned Doctors for the NHS. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. The real danger is, of course, moving to the insurance-based system like we have in the States. And I'm just wondering, what do you see as the role of the CCGs? I mean, there's been the suggestion that the CCGs could morph into something like the HMOs in the States, and with the advent, and this would be facilitated with the advent of the personal health budgets. So I'm just wondering, what do you actually see happening with the CCGs in this move?
Before they've even properly bedded down, two things are happening to them. One is they're starting to merge. We're getting multiple CCGs. In fact, it's effectively restoring PCDs and strategic health authorities all over again. But the other is they're being subverted by so-called commissioning support units. These are units that are going to tell them how to commission. And a lot of these commissioning support units are themselves private agencies. I worry about HMOs, as I suspect you do as well, because there is such a conflict of interest built into them. And if I face a patient and have to decide I have to ring up the chief executive of my organisation before I can decide whether this patient can have this test and that test, clearly already my professional judgment is compromised. So I am very worried about what's happening. CCGs are bad enough and secret enough already. The fact they may now be doing inter-CCG work, working with local area teams, being directed by NHS England, and also being supported by so-called commissioning support units, I think we'll lose the audit trail completely. So, and thank you for what you said about insurance-based services. It's just extraordinarily worrying. Yeah.
Thank you, Ray. Going forwards, where do you see the money from the state for over £100 billion a year to run the NHS, and now 2 to 3 billion in NHS litigation, which you expect me to mention? Is it quite simple? NHS or Trident, NHS or H2S, or HS2 rather?
Thank you. Yes, go ahead. I don't think that generally is the choice. Mind you, I think HS2 is a steaming heap of donkey droppings, but that's a personal view. That's not for the record, by the way. But looking at where the money's coming from. Well, first of all, we could save an awful lot of money by stopping the market. Between 5 and 10 billion, probably 10 billion. Secondly, we should look at the PFI contracts, which are costing billions and billions and billions. Thirdly, we should make sure that...
Where did they come from?
Well, they came originally from John Major and Stephen Dorrell and all that gang, but then they were, having been rejected by Labour, they were embraced by Labour, for the reason that essentially they thought that they could have capital expenditure without infringing on the convergence criteria for European Union. So it was a fiddle, but it's come home to haunt them. So there's another huge sum of money. Thirdly, there would be making sure that those private providers do actually pay taxes, which then feed back into what private providers we have into the NHS. And then we have a debate about how much we want to spend. In 2002-ish, I can't remember, Gordon Brown asked the people, did they want to pay more taxes to the NHS? And the answer was a resounding yes, and he raised national insurance. A result of which, we've had a massively improved NHS. If you ask that question again, according to recent polls, 59% of the population would support increased taxes. And that must be a record for supporting increased taxes. So I think people are willing to pay more. But finally, we need to have a debate about the configuration of services, which isn't held to ransom by MPs who are trying to protect their majorities. We've had some awful examples of a potential rational reorganisation that would improve services and save money, which have been blocked by local MPs wanting to. So I think if we do all that and have a rational discussion, I don't think there is a problem. I see I'm optimistic after all.
I'll take one last question.
Professor, being a psychiatrist, I do not understand figures and mathematics. But I do know one or two things about philosophy, and you are a philosopher. How much gloom and darkness it may be, there are always few rays of light. Can you please comment about it as well?
Well, I mean, I think there are rays of light. I mean, one wouldn't bother, in a sense, fighting something if you didn't think there was a possibility of changing things. You know, as far as I'm concerned, it's because I'm ultimately optimistic that I've been ranting to you this evening. You know, I wouldn't bother ranting. You know, one doesn't rant against, I don't know what, the big crunch or whatever. You know, you just accept it's the future of the universe. So in that sense, I think there is a possibility of changing things. I know what will happen, that even the parties that seem to be on our side when it comes to patient care will compromise in a way that will make it almost impossible to recognise what one voted for. Could well happen. But I still think there is mileage in stopping this runaway train from gathering speed. That's sort of optimistic, isn't it?
Right, I think it's time to draw this evening to a close. Ray, I'd like to thank you personally very much for what we'd all agree is a very comprehensive and interesting, stimulating analysis of what's going on. The last time Ray and I shared a stage, I don't know whether you can remember, was the medical students' dinner when Ray was the guest speaker.
Oh God, yes.
Yes, you're president, I was the guest speaker. This was a rather airless downstairs room with rather bad ventilation and had these huge big fans which seemed to disseminate the coconut gatto, cream gatto, the whole room at great speed. But Ray, it's been, I'm very pleased you accepted the invitation to come, and on behalf of the institution members, very grateful for you coming. I'd just like to thank you in the usual.
Well, thank you for having me.